1 year ago, I was on a school trip in Chicago. One day, my classmates and I were on a tour of a rather lower middle class neighborhood when an elderly man sitting on a bench next to us started shouting certain phrases at our group. I heard some curses, slurs, but also bits of speech that were difficult to understand. Now, in the moment, we all thought this man was just a catcaller, but some dirty looks were given and an uneasy feeling of awkwardness plagued my classmates and my teachers. After a few moments, our tour guide, who was a rather well-known man in the neighborhood, actually turned at the man, smiled, and waved at him. It seemed like the two knew each other, and the man then smiled and waved back. Now, in this moment, we were a bit confused for a sec, but that was until our tour guide turned around back to us and said, "I'm sorry, some people here have Tourette Syndrome." Now, for as long as I can remember, I've lived with ticks, and yes, ticks, but not those tiny little blood-sucking insects. Thankfully, I don't have those kinds of ticks. I have tics, the ones that are spelled Tics, and those tics are the primary symptom of Tourette syndrome. Now, according to the Center for Disease Control, about 1 in every 160 school-age children from the ages of 3 to 17 have Tourette syndrome. And in order to be diagnosed with Tourette's, you need at least 2 motor tics and 1 vocal tic. What are motor tics? Well, motor tics are what I would do when I twitch my neck or shrug my shoulders around like that. It would be a movement, an involuntary movement that I can't control, which involves movement of my limbs or body parts. And a vocal tic is exactly what it sounds like. It's a sound that you would make. Now, the man that we came across actually turned out to have a very specific kind of vocal tic, one that's called coprolalia. You've probably heard of this before as like the cursing tic, but it involves like the shouting out of curses or socially unacceptable phrases or words. But it's a common misconception that a lot of people with Tourette's have coprolalia because actually only 10% of people with Tourette's have coprolalia. Now, Tourette's is also a genetic condition. So for example, my grandfather, father, and I all have had Tourette's, except we've all experienced it in very different ways. Most people with Tourette's also have co-occurring conditions such as ADHD, depression, anxiety, or OCD. For me, having ADHD along with some other conditions over the years has been oftentimes more of a challenge than the tics themselves. Now, I was lucky to have been diagnosed from an early age, but I also realized that having a family history with Tourette's made it easier for my family to understand what was really going on. Now, when I was in 8th grade, I lived in New York. And the local chapter that I was a part of at the time had many kids and families that also had Tourette's just like me. I became a youth ambassador for the Tourette Association of America, and through that, I met many kids that had many different forms of the condition that it made me realize about a whole new aspect of what Tourette's could be. I met kids that had such severe forms of the condition, it made me thankful to not have experienced that side of Tourette's. But I also realized that generally within the New York area, there's a lot more awareness and acceptance about Tourette's. But I only realized that when I moved here to Dayton about a year and a half ago. About last March, I actually lobbied to senators and representatives from Ohio in the United States Congress to help fund research for Tourette syndrome. Now, at the moment, there is no cure for Tourette's, and treatment options can be fairly limited and are oftentimes very expensive for most families here. Although we were working through Zoom, I met another set of families that had very different experiences with Tourette's than the ones that I'd met in New York. First of all, they told me stories about them having to travel oftentimes hours across the state just to get basic treatment or even just a diagnosis because there's not a lot of awareness about Tourette's even amongst physicians in Ohio. But I'm not here to tell you about how ignorant and uninformed people in Ohio are, because I've realized that in a way we're all pretty ignorant. And the problems that I've mentioned today don't just exist within Ohio, but they actually exist around the world. When I lived in New York, I learned about Tourette's as a neurological condition and the direct impacts that it had on people when doing their basic daily tasks. But coming to Ohio, I learned about a new set of challenges. Living with Tourette's or any neurological condition, as a matter of fact, can be a pretty complicated experience. It's one of the challenges we have is figuring out how to communicate the elephant in the room while being accepting and understanding of those listening, because frankly, it can be kind of difficult and annoying and repetitive to constantly have to justify and explain our actions whenever we tic in public. But to give you a better idea of what I mean, I'll give you an example of a scenario that I encounter quite often. So like I said, my father and I both have Tourette's, and our family likes to go out to eat once in a while. And after a long day of work, both me and my father are tired. And for most people, Tourette's and their tics can be worsened during times of excitement or when you're tired, or for example, when we're waiting for our food after a long day of work. My father has a neck tic, which can at times get pretty severe, but I've learned to cope with it and accept it. Now, in this moment, as my father's so hungry for his food, so am I. The food arrives at our table, and my father's neck tic begins to kick in aggressively. I want to make sure that my father's comfortable, but I also don't want to, offend the people around me and be too aggressive when I confront them. So I ask you this question: what would you do in that scenario? Would you confront the people around you, or would you stay silent? If you're struggling to come up with any definitive answer, I don't blame you, because I'll be honest with you. Most times the situation arises, I do nothing. And that's because I've realized that when it comes to our tics, I can't always explain myself to other people. And so I've become more confident being around my father in public whenever he tics and when I tic around other people. Despite living with Tourette's, I continued to learn more about the condition every day. We oftentimes make assumptions that aren't true, and in my case, I made an assumption about another man based on his outward appearance, thinking that he must have been homeless and helpless, when in reality, he had the same condition that I had. When I realized that I misjudged this man, it wasn't impactful to me just because I couldn't identify his condition, but it was actually because I made a whole set of assumptions that actually enforced the stereotypes that we have about Tourette's in the first place. When I told you that I had Tourette's, I wonder what you thought about me. Maybe you had some assumptions about what I had gone through. Maybe you even had some assumptions about what Tourette's even was before this talk. And hopefully by listening to me today, you've learned something new. It's a unique experience growing up in a family that has a history of Tourette's, while also being one of the people in that family that actually has Tourette's. Because I've gone through my own challenges and have overcome a lot of them, but I look up to people like my father and see the challenges that he's overcome. Although those challenges may be different, it is important to realize that my challenges aren't to be negated, and they're still very valid, even though I've failed sometimes, but I've overcome them, many others. Living with Tourette's can present a variety of challenges. It's easy for people to make assumptions based on your outward appearances, but it is important to realize that Tourette's is a neurological condition that affects people in many different ways. Well, an increased awareness and education about Tourette's can help break down stigmas and create a more compassionate and understanding society. By supporting research and advocacy efforts, we can eventually work towards better treatment options and maybe one day even a cure. But most importantly, we can strive to create a society that's understanding and accepting of everyone for who they are, because sometimes tolerance can be the best form of treatment. My name is Ilhaan, and I have Tourette Syndrome. Thank you.